Hey everybody, welcome to Ask a Pastor. Today I want to answer the question that has been asked to me in lots of different ways throughout the years. And it's essentially the question of what do we do with those pieces of the Bible, those scripture passages that really seem to be to contradict some of the overarching narrative of the scripture. So we are told a story in the Bible about a God who liberates people from Egypt, who liberates people from slavery. And that's where the story begins. And the rest of the story is this working out of a God who refuses to let people suffer alone, who continuously brings things back to right or is working toward restoration and is constantly widening, broadening the circle of who is welcome, who is accepted, and who is loved by God. And we see this worked out from the very beginning in the creation narratives. In the book of Genesis, we're told stories about, usually through poetry, we're told these stories about who God is and what the world is and what God's relationship to the world is. And one of those key stories is a story of the flood in Genesis, the deluge, where sin has kind of broken things down to the point where now creation is being undone. The waters that were separated in the very beginning are now crashing down into each other. And you have the story of Noah and the ark, and God interrupts that process of destruction with a promise of new creation, the promise of the rainbow, the promise that this will not happen again. And God redeems the world and saves the world and brings things back to right. And that becomes kind of a story that's paradigmatic for the rest of Scripture. That we have a story of a God who refuses to let the world end on its own terms, a God who refuses to give up on the world and insists that God, that love is going to have the last word. That is the overarching narrative of the scripture, a story of a God who liberates, a God who creates and recreates and saves and loves. And ultimately, as we fast forward to the book of Revelation, we see the image of God coming and dwelling with human beings and with all of creation in a completely renewed world where there will be where the shedding of tears, where every tear will be wiped away, and joy and love will finally win. We all kind of long for that, don't we? And that story kind of permeates everything we do in the church. The whole church calendar is built around that story, particularly through the life of Jesus, and as Jesus is God's revelation to the world, we celebrate that in Jesus, God is revealed to be a God of resurrection, a God of new life, a God of opening and broadening, a God who welcomes strangers, a God who forgives sinners, a God who heals the sick and sides with the oppressed. That's the overarching story of Scripture. And every once in a while, we see these passages of Scripture that seem to contradict that and that can become really complicated. Now, I first of all just want to say I think you should be a little careful with anyone who offers a really neat and tidy answer to those things. One of those traditional answers is that, like, the God of the Old Testament is a different God than the God of the New Testament. God was angry and vengeful, and then God changed and is now loving and kind. That's, first of all, not really faithful to the New Testament, where we also find really challenging passages, but it's not faithful to the Old Testament either. And the entire prophetic tradition that constantly points to a God who chooses justice, a God who insists on righteousness and love and restoration. So not only should we beware because it's unfaithful to the interpretation of the scripture as a whole. But we should also beware because it doesn't tell the story that the whole Bible is telling. The whole Bible again is telling a story of resurrection, of restoration, of justice, of broadening, right? So anytime we see a scripture passage that contradicts that, that seems to be narrowing, that, for example, there's this really classic one where it talks about women should not speak in the church is something that the Apostle Paul writes. Now, if you come across that, it's really hard to reconcile that one passage with the larger story of Jesus, especially Jesus, who constantly elevates women and lifts up women. In fact, in the Gospels, it's women's responsibility. Women are given the very first responsibility of preaching the gospel to the world. Remember when the angel meets with the women at the tomb of the resurrected Christ and says to them, "Go and tell the others." I mean, that's the very first example of that. And then Paul in the New Testament constantly is listing women as leaders in the church. Some scholars have argued that most of the leadership of the early church was women because women would have been kind of the hosts of these meals, and the meal of the Eucharist, the meal of communion was kind of the central element of worship for the early church. So women are constantly being lifted up, praised, elevated as leaders in the church, as prophets, and Jesus is lifting them up. And so, what could possibly what do we do with a passage that says, "Oh, women should be silent in the church"? Uh, well, without going into all the details of an exegetical of interpreting that passage in its context and all that work, there's some work that needs to be done on those passages. But uh, I'll just give you a clue as to what I understand to be the best way of understanding this. When we read the scriptures, we should always take with us that larger narrative, the larger picture of what it means, what the whole Bible is telling us. That story of a God who broadens love, who opens up, who redeems and restores and demands justice. And we should interpret those smaller passages in light of that larger narrative. So if I see women be silent in the church, what should come into question is not my understanding of the larger narrative, not first anyway. What should come into question is the simple reading of that passage. If I understand the whole Bible to be telling a story where new people, marginalized people, which in the ancient world would definitely have included women, is now where that story is being broadened and opened up to more and more people, then when I see a passage that seems to be limiting and seems to be countering the story of love that the Bible is telling, it's that passage that I should be questioning. It's I should hold that passage accountable to the larger narrative. More specifically, I should hold my reading of that passage accountable to the larger story. So, as a rule, I would say, if you come across a scripture that seems to counter the story of love that the Bible is telling, question your reading of that scripture before you try either to neatly reconcile it or uh, or before you try to question the larger narrative or completely throw out any understanding that makes any sense of love and justice. So if you find an unjust passage of scripture, hold your reading of that passage sorry, hold your reading of that passage accountable to the larger narrative and not the other way around. So, as a rule, I guess to put it really simply, as a rule, if you find yourself choosing between your understanding of scripture and love, the overarching story of love that the Bible tells, choose the love part. Read the whole story of Scripture through the lens of love, and you're probably on the right track. And so when you find a passage that says women be silent in the church, well, of course, Paul can't possibly have meant that in and of itself in every circumstance because he clearly in other places is elevating women to leadership. So if you find yourself in a place where you're wondering, hey, should I exclude women from leadership in the church? Um, don't you need to hold that reading accountable to the larger story of God, the larger story of a God who opens and broadens and meets new people. So there's lots of these. That's just one example of those passages, but that's what I kind of want to. The rule I'll leave you with, rather than getting into the nitty gritty of all the different interpretive moves that need to be made on passages like those. I would just say take with you the larger story of Scripture anytime you read the text. Anytime you read a discrete individual passage, hold it in light of the larger, beautiful library of literature that we have in the canon of Scripture. That's my perspective as a pastor. I hope it's helpful for you. But that question is not super easy, and all of these individual passages where God seems to be smiting people and killing people and commanding Israel to destroy people and their livestock and all these terrible things that we see throughout Scripture. We should always those aren't neat and easy passages. Those are difficult, but we should always hold them under the light of the overarching narrative of Scripture, which is a God who redeems, a God who liberates, a God who stands with the oppressed, a God who demands justice, a God who says, "Put away your sword," a God who is raised from the dead in Jesus Christ and conquers death so that love can have the last word. That's the story of Scripture, and that is the story that should relativize and be the lens through which we interpret every other passage of Scripture. So there's a thought for you. I hope it's good food for thought, and I hope it's a helpful perspective, just the perspective of one pastor, but I hope it's helpful. You have a great day, and we'll talk again soon.